On the morning of September 16, 1992, something impossible was supposed to happen, and then did. A government with one of the oldest central banks on earth lost a public fight with the foreign exchange markets in a single day. Not through war, not through scandal, but through the quiet clicking of trading desks across London, New York, and Tokyo. By nightfall, the British pound was in freefall. Billions of pounds of public money were gone, and the country's leaders were standing in front of cameras, trying to explain how they had been outmaneuvered by investors they had insisted only hours earlier they could control. The mystery is not simply that Britain lost. It is how a proud nation convinced itself that it could pin down a living, breathing currency to an artificial price, and why so many intelligent people believed that confidence alone could overpower economic gravity. For most of the post-war era, the pound had been a symbol not just of money but of national survival. Britain had emerged from the Second World War exhausted, indebted, and clinging to memories of imperial power that no longer matched economic reality. Through the 1950s and 60s, the pound was devalued, defended, rescued, and devalued again. Each episode carved a scar into the political class. To be seen as unable to defend the currency was to be branded weak, unfit to govern, perhaps even unpatriotic. By the late 1980s, this fear had fused with a new European dream. A growing belief had taken hold that Britain's future prosperity lay not in clinging to a lonely island identity, but in locking itself into the rising project of European integration. At the center of that project was a mechanism called the exchange rate mechanism, a polite technical phrase for a brutal promise. Every member country would keep its currency within a narrow band against the German mark, the continent's anchor of discipline and credibility. The logic sounded seductive. If Britain could bind the pound to the mark, inflation would fall, investors would trust the currency, interest rates would stabilize, and the boom and bust cycles of the past would finally be tamed. But beneath that neat theory lay a dangerous assumption. It assumed that Britain's economy behaved like Germany's. It assumed that Britain's inflation, productivity, wage growth, and housing market were roughly in sync with Europe's strongest industrial engine. They were not. Britain was coming off a late 1980s credit boom, driven by deregulated finance and surging property prices. When that boom turned into a crash, unemployment climbed, homeowners slipped into negative equity, and growth slowed sharply. Germany, meanwhile, had just reunited. Its economy was overheating, its government was spending heavily to rebuild the East, and its central bank was raising interest rates to choke off inflation. To remain tied to the mark, Britain would have to import Germany's tight money policy, whether it suited Britain or not. Still, in October of 1990, the government, led by Prime Minister John Major, took the plunge and joined the exchange rate mechanism. The pound was set at a central rate of 2.95 German marks, with only a narrow band of movement allowed above or below. In public, ministers framed this as a bold act of leadership. Privately, many knew it was a gamble. To keep the pound within its band, the Bank of England would have to raise interest rates whenever pressure appeared, regardless of the damage to the domestic economy. That meant squeezing borrowers, crushing already fragile businesses, and risking a deeper recession. But they believed that the pain would be temporary, that credibility would be earned, and that the markets would eventually fall into line. For a while, the illusion held. The pound drifted uneasily, but remained within its limits. Yet every month, the fundamentals grew more hostile. Britain's trade deficit widened. Inflation stayed higher than in Germany. The housing market continued to bleed. Then, in the summer of 1992, a political earthquake on the continent shattered what little stability remained. Denmark held a referendum on a treaty that would deepen European integration. To the shock of Europe's leaders, Danish voters rejected it. Suddenly, the future of the entire European project was in doubt. Investors began to reassess every promise tied to that dream. If Europe might fracture, why should anyone believe that governments would continue to defend fixed exchange rates at enormous domestic cost? The markets, smelled vulnerability. Hedge funds and large institutional traders began to probe the pound's defenses. Among them was George Soros, a financier already famous for understanding that currencies were not numbers on a screen, but expressions of political will. He and others did not start by declaring war. They tested. They sold modest amounts of pounds, watching how aggressively the Bank of England responded. Each defense revealed information. Each intervention signaled not strength, but fear. It was a dance of bluff and counter-bluff, played at the speed of global finance. By early September, pressure was relentless. Italy was forced to devalue its currency. Spain widened its trading band. One by one, members of the exchange rate mechanism blinked. Britain insisted it would not. Ministers went on television declaring that the pound's parity was non-negotiable. The Bank of England burned through reserves, buying pounds in the open market, trying to create artificial demand to prop up the price. But for every pound the bank bought, speculators sold more. It was not an emotional fight. It was arithmetic. Traders believed that Britain could not sustain the required interest rates without tearing its economy apart. And if that belief was correct, then the pound's official rate was a lie waiting to be exposed. Then came Black Wednesday. In the gray dawn hours of September 16th, the selling intensified. The Bank of England was already intervening heavily, but it was like pouring cups of water onto a forest fire. By mid-morning, the government announced an emergency interest rate hike from 10% to 12%, hoping to lure investors back with higher returns. It did not work. The selling accelerated. At lunchtime, in a moment of near panic, ministers announced that rates would rise again, this time to 15%. The message was supposed to be uncompromising. We will do whatever it takes. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Markets interpreted the move as desperation. They did not see a confident state. They saw a cornered one. Behind the scenes, the numbers were catastrophic. The Bank of England was spending billions of pounds buying its own currency. Traders were dumping them just as fast. It was a one-way bet. If the pound somehow survived, speculators would lose some interest income. If it failed, they would make fortunes. Late in the afternoon, the inevitable happened. The government admitted defeat. Britain would suspend its membership in the exchange rate mechanism. The pound would float freely. The 15% rate rise was cancelled before it even came into effect. Within hours, the currency fell sharply, wiping out years of carefully cultivated prestige. The immediate fallout was humiliation. Newspapers screamed betrayal and incompetence. The Treasury estimated that the cost of the day's interventions ran into billions of pounds. For a conservative government that had campaigned on economic competence, the damage was existential. Trust, once lost, does not return easily. The party would not recover its reputation for stewardship for a generation. Yet the deeper story is more complicated. Freed from the straitjacket of the exchange rate mechanism, the pound fell to a level that reflected Britain's actual economic condition. Exports became cheaper. Interest rates were cut. Slowly, almost quietly, the economy began to recover. By the mid-1990s, growth returned. Inflation stayed under control. Unemployment fell. In one of history's great ironies, the policy disaster that ended in national embarrassment also laid the groundwork for a decade of relative stability. But that does not make Black Wednesday a success. It makes it a warning. The men who engineered Britain's entry into the exchange rate mechanism were not fools. They were experienced policymakers, acting under intense political pressure, haunted by past failures, and seduced by a grand narrative of European unity. They believed that if they appeared firm enough, markets would submit. What they underestimated was the cumulative power of small doubts multiplied across global capital. No speech, no press conference, no patriotic appeal can permanently override economic reality. The failure did not stop with the pound. It echoed across Europe. The exchange rate mechanism limped on, but its credibility was shattered. When the euro was later introduced, designers would claim to have learned from the chaos, building deeper institutions to support the shared currency. Yet the memory of Black Wednesday lingered in the background, a reminder that monetary unions are not technical constructs but political promises, and that those promises can fracture under stress. So what can we take from the long arc of that day, from the optimistic theories of the late 1980s to the televised surrender of 1992? First, that credibility cannot be manufactured by decree. It emerges from alignment between policy and reality. Britain wanted the discipline of Germany without paying the social cost Germany was willing to endure. Second, that markets are not enemies of the state but mirrors. When they attack a currency, they are often reflecting imbalances that governments would rather not face. And third, that humiliation is not always the end of the story. Sometimes, it is the beginning of correction, the moment when illusion gives way to adaptation. As we look at modern economies that still cling to pegs, bands, and rigid promises in a world of volatile capital flows, the ghost of Black Wednesday still whispers. It asks whether today's leaders are defending fundamentals or defending pride. It asks how many billions can be burned before confidence breaks. And it leaves us with a final uncomfortable thought. If one of the world's oldest financial institutions could be forced to blink in a single day, what does that say about the fragility of every promise built on numbers rather than trust? If this story changed the way you see currencies, power, or the hidden machinery of finance, take a moment to subscribe. Share it with someone who still believes governments always win. And join me in the next episode, where we peel back another layer of history to see what really happens when theory collides with reality.